Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer, and this is Dr. Greer, and I'm joined today with Dr. Ted Loder, the Science Advisor for the OrionProject.org, and a very dear friend who's worked for many years on these issues with us. And we're going to be talking today about the catastrophic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico that British Petroleum has caused, and the implications of it, but also what the real solutions are that no one in the mainstream media is talking about. So thank you, Ted, for being with us today.
Well, it's good to be with you, Steve.
So I think to set the stage for this, of course, everyone, unless you've been in a coma for the last 7 weeks, know about this catastrophic spill that's gushing millions and millions of gallons a day of toxic crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico, and it is the biggest disaster environmentally in U.S. history, and the background of it. But what a lot of people don't realize, and we're really very fortunate to have Dr. Loder with us today on this call, because he is a professor emeritus at University of New Hampshire and is a chemical oceanographer, and can speak to some of the ramifications of what we're finding about this particular spill and what it means for the Earth and for our environment and to the life in the ocean. So I don't know, Ted, if you want to talk a bit about that.
A couple comments which have been talked about in the press, but definitely bear repeating. One is that oil, as most people are aware at some level, is really a mixture of literally thousands and thousands of hydrocarbon compounds. Some are very light. They're either gaseous if they were at room temperature, or they're very lightweight, molecular weight speaking. Some are very, very heavy, long chains of hydrocarbons that actually form the asphalt and the tar that we use on our roads, and the heavier oils in the bunker sea oil and what have you. So the oil that comes out of the ground, if you will, is a mixture of these many, many gases, from methane, which is 1 carbon and 4 hydrogen, very, very light, which is the gas or the natural gas that people use in their houses, to the much heavier things. And it turns out there's also very complex hydrocarbons of various sorts with benzene rings and the circular rings of carbon and what have you. And a lot of these tend to be very, very toxic, particularly the lighter weight things. The tar itself, although toxic if you ate a bunch of them, is not as toxic as some of the lighter weight hydrocarbons. And so when the oil gets squirted into the water, these lighter weight hydrocarbons dissolve into the water, and can, if they're near the surface where the food chain starts, if you will, where the phytoplankton, the tiny plankton in the ocean live, those lightweight hydrocarbons can affect the eggs in the young stages of these various larval stages, which even if there are no adults around, of say shrimp or whatever else, it can affect the younger stages. Now, one of the major concerns for the shrimp industry, for example, in the Gulf of Mexico, is the shrimp tend to be bottom feeders, live on the bottom, and so the heavier oils or hydrocarbons can sink to the bottom. The bacteria try to chew up this organic matter and utilize oxygen to do that. In doing so, they remove oxygen from the water columns, and so you end up with a situation where there's very low or no oxygen on the bottom. Now, the Gulf of Mexico for decades has had a problem with, quote, dead zones, areas of the bottom where there's been no oxygen for several months, a year. And these areas have basically been removed. Many of the organisms, particularly those that we fish for, from those areas, particularly shrimp in the Gulf, which is a multi-$100 million, if not $1 billion industry. So that's one of the concerns. So the pictures we see of the tar washing up on the shore, killing turtles and birds and what have you, because it wets their feathers down, etc., are just a very small percentage of the actual impact of this material. And one further comment is that the marshes of Louisiana, all on the coast, Alabama, parts of Florida, all on that Texas coast, etc., the marshes and marshlands are incredible nurseries for young shrimp and various young fish. Larval stages grow up in the marsh where there's lots to eat, and then they move out to the Gulf as adults. So if we get a lot of this oil into the marshes, then this will start affecting the larval stages. So this can have an impact years later as these young who never existed because they got killed would have grown up into adults and then been fished down the line. So it's even if the oil stopped today, the residual effect is many years in lasting. And this coating the bottom and causing oxygen to be depleted, increasing the potential dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is a very, very real impact.
But dead zones that have been there for years are really the result of so much of the fertilizer and other.
That is absolutely correct. That is absolutely correct.
From the Mississippi Delta into the Gulf, and again, you get this blooming of microorganisms that use up all the oxygen, and then everything else dies. So they're saying this is going to happen on steroids there in the Gulf, and because of this is exactly what's happening with these microorganisms eating the oil, as it were. But they're going to use up all the oxygen, and they just had on the news yesterday a person from the University of Georgia that said that they had found that they were right at the cutoff of the oxygen concentration of where life can live in vast areas of the Gulf where this oil has gone because of this phenomenon. And I might also point out that the wetlands that are being coated and destroyed is not just what's being killed that are that are larvae and life and birds and pelicans and all that everyone's seen, but the actual marsh grass themselves are being killed, and that's going to be a loss of that land mass for a protective barrier for New Orleans and other cities. And to give people an idea, I mean, this just sounds really trivial, but I have a farm out here near University of Virginia and near Thomas Jefferson's home here in Virginia, and we have a farmer who cuts hay, which we have organic hay, and he likes it for his cows, but the farmer who was doing this about 10 years ago spilled a little bit of fuel on some of the land, and that area 10 years later has nothing that will grow on it. No grass, no hay, nothing, dead. And so this junk, this murderous, cancer-causing, death-inducing, life-destroying, noxious, poisonous junk called oil that our society is addicted to is really deadly. And that's what people don't understand about this. Now, add to that, into this slurry of filth, the most toxic dispersant that's on the market that BP is using in defiance of the EPA and of all scientific, when there's a dozen other products that are less toxic and more effective. And you're just creating a toxic chemical stew in this vast area of one of the most abundant estuaries and one of the most abundant areas for sea life in the world, where the bluefin tuna spawn, where all kinds of things. So, and the point of this, of course, I mean, many people have heard some of this already, but I think that what we want to focus on is the fact that, number one, British Petroleum is the fourth largest corporation on earth. Number two, they misrepresented that when they got these licenses for deep water drilling, that they could take care of an accident much bigger than this one with alacrity and ease, when in fact that was a complete falsification, misrepresentation, lie, and criminal misrepresentation of what their capabilities were. And number three, we don't need oil. And, Dr. Loder was telling me before we started the interview that he had just seen on an economic blog an economist talking about the fact that there has been active and ruthless suppression of Tesla-type technologies for decades, which, of course, we've been saying on this program, and which we have very well documented at theorionproject.org. If you go to the website, you will see there are many, many accounts of these kinds of suppressive activities, including what we have just gone through in the last few months, trying to get together some of these top-secret scientists to work on these solutions so we don't need oil anymore. So I think that this falls now into a category of something that I'm going to call, and some would say ungenerously, but I think accurately, Murder Incorporated. And Murder Incorporated is this consortium of interests that are international, transnational corporate and financial interests that will do anything to maintain their grip on the global macroeconomic geopolitical order and on the energy sector, which drives our entire economy. And this is why when people have tried to come forward, whether it's Nikola Tesla 100 years ago or our team in the last 6 months with some scientists who wanted to, as it were, leave the government sector of top secret research and work with us, that you have this massive machine that kicks in that intimidates, threatens, has murdered, suppresses, uses illegal applications of the National Security Act, illegal applications of Title 35, Section 180 and 181 of the patent law, which allows for national security seizure of patents. Some 4,000 such patents, we're told, by a man who worked in the patent office, have been seized and suppressed, and these sorts of things. So this conglomeration of special interests that are oil, big energy sector, petrodollar interests, have so corrupted government processes. And, of course, this has come out with the MMS, the mineral and mining entity, where they were finding that people who were supposed to be regulating BP and these oil companies were actually, having affairs with them and getting free first-class tickets and going on cruises and doing God knows what all. That what you find is that there is this collusion and corruption all through the system. And at the same time, this corruption is brought to bear in abusing the power of the national security state to stop these technologies from coming out that would be the definitive replacement of oil, gas, coal, and nuclear power, which is exactly what the OrionProject.org is working on. And thanks to many of you listeners who contributed, we're continuing to fight the good fight. But what is really, as I watch the media coverage of this, Ted, I think one of the things that I'm astonished by is the fact that no one is talking about the fact that the President of the United States, now having made 3 or 4 trips down there, and every top-level cabinet person, and all the so-called MIT brain trust and engineering trust that's come in, not a single person has come forward to talk about the very advanced technologies that exist within classified projects that include the so-called alien reproduction vehicles and these so-called anti-gravity vehicles that could, with alacrity, go down to the bottom of that ocean, 5,000 feet beneath the water, and seal this thing probably within 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Now, this is something not talked about because we're talking about the WSFM, weird science and frickin' magic, as it's called in the trade, of very advanced technologies that are transdimensional, anti-gravity, free energy, where, this thing of, when I look at what they're talking about, the solutions of these junk shots and capping this thing mechanically, we're talking about Newtonian-era engineering. And the advanced sciences and physics, which exist within classified projects, aren't being brought to bear to fix this, even though this is killing an entire ecosystem. So this is, at this point, in my opinion, reached the point where the public need to write the White House and say, look into the OrionProject.org types of technologies we're talking about and get these technologies to be brought to bear to, A, stop the leak and the gusher immediately, B, clean it up, and C, bring out those technologies so we don't need to do any more drilling in the Gulf or Alaska or anywhere else, because we do not need it. The discussion is always, you always hear these people, well, we want to be safe, but we have to drill because we need the oil because we don't have anything else. Well, this is nonsense. And it's proven to be nonsense.
That is so correct. And recently, the Scientific American, I was trying to find as we're speaking here, I was trying to find the article, and although I can't put my fingers on it right now, but I think in a Scientific American article or magazine coming up very soon, this summer, there's a discussion of 8 different technologies, energy technologies, and I looked through them the other day, and not one of them is outside the box. They are micro nanocrystalline better solar panels. They're better wind, they're tides, and a few other things. Not one of them is outside what is termed the conventional energy technology. And this is what Scientific American is publishing as its real assessment of the present situation. And that's, of course, people see it, Scientific American. I'm not picking on them. They do a lot of interesting things. But in this case, they're missing the boat in terms of informing people of the reality of what technologies are available. It's very sad.
Well, it is. And I think this is one of the things. It's not as if there's no scientific literature or evidence for these technologies. These are not urban myths, in other words. And yet you don't see the mainstream media or the political establishment talking about them at all. And I have to emphasize, not only would they prevent these sort of spills because we would no longer need to be drilling for oil like this, but also these technologies. I mean, we have guys that Dr. Loder and I have met with personally and spent quite a bit of time with who have worked on these so-called electromagnetic systems, these anti-gravity systems that when they're underwater are called, USOs and instead of a UFO. But what you find is that these technologies, because of the nature of the physics, move through water and adjust, or the air, with no drag and no wake. This is why there's no sonic boom when one of these objects is moving at 20, 30, 40,000 miles an hour and makes a right-hand turn without decelerating. It's controlling for one gravity, and there's no wake or movement of the air because it has this effect where it creates almost like an electrostatic bubble around it, which is one of the technologies we're talking about investigating in this. The OrionProject.org is proposing to do a research and development program here, and we're just finishing a new proposal, which anyone who knows some philanthropists or people who can help fund it should get hold of us immediately. And I think that what people have to understand is that these technologies, we have people that we have met with who have worked on these technologies since the 60s. They're fully operational. And at disclosureproject.org, you can see a testimony from people like Mark McCandlish, and I've met Brad Sorensen, who saw these man-made anti-gravity devices. These are not things from another star system.
The ARVs.
And they're called alien reproduction vehicles that were floating in a hangar at the Norton Air Force Base in California back some years ago. It's been closed now, this base. And there were, three of them. There was one that was around 25 feet, and one around 50 feet, and one that was 100 feet in diameter, and they were just floating in this hangar. And their startup power system was a 24-volt marine battery, and then these coils would go over unity, meaning they'd pick up the energy from the quantum vacuum of space around them, and were configured in such a way that there was a mass cancellation effect, and the things were just floating there. Now, these things have been built, and these were old ones that had been built in the 60s that this guy saw in the 80s. Now, here we are in 2010, and the best thing we're bringing to bear for this global environmental and ecological catastrophe is 1800s era jump shots in Newtonian physics. Please. This is scandalous. This has reached the point of such outrage. And I am personally so outraged by this. And one of the reasons I am, and I'm going to be very honest here, and I can only say so much. I'm going to have to draw the line with how far I go on this discussion, Ted. But you know the person I'm talking about. There's a man who is extremely, in extremis, close to the President of the United States, Barack Obama, who has received the briefing materials and the information on these energy systems, on the illegal classification of these systems, and the need for presidential executive action to get those technologies under his command to be used to benefit humanity. Now, this briefing and this information has gone to someone extremely underlined and writ large close to the president. This we know and we have proof of. The question I have is, why doesn't the President of the United States, who has now been given the name, project code numbers, project code names, and information, including the corporate entities and where they're located and what these technologies are, Why hasn't he set up a commission to get control of those and put them to use to fix this problem? See, this is where I know it would take a lot of courage, because you're standing down a $600 trillion monster called Murder Incorporated, who stops at almost nothing to keep these technologies secret. But for heaven's sakes, we're destroying this planet. And before we end up coating this beautiful blue planet completely in oil, I think that someone needs to stand up and say, wait a minute here. There are some very advanced technologies that are just sitting on a shelf, suppressed, that could be brought to bear to fix the problem and to ensure that we never go down this road again and never have to drill another oil well in the Gulf of Mexico or in Alaska or anywhere else for that matter. But no one is bringing this issue up. And I think the people who are listening to the OrionProject.org need to call the White House and write them, and that information is on our website at theorionproject.org, and demand that action be taken on this issue.
I think that's a very good point, because if it continues as it appears to be, with people fumbling around, dropping the ball, so to speak, the potential environmental disaster is much, much larger, and there's a lot of things that are not being talked about by the mainstream media or just barely touched on it. And if I may change the subject just briefly for a moment, I need to bring this up.
Sure.
One of the research experiments that was done a number of years ago was looking at the rainfall due to huge storms on the West Coast and off the Gulf of Mexico, and hurricanes that go inland. And what these researchers found is they collected rainfall, and they found marine plankton, little tiny marine plants, in the rainfall, many hundreds, if not 1,000 miles or more away from the coast. Here's the concern. If that is indeed the case, which is that there's scientific proof that was in that study that does occur, the dispersants that are being added, which are cancer-causing, very, very nasty chemicals, and they put millions of gallons of that stuff out there, those dispersants could be very easily picked up from the ocean and carried inland, and then in our rainfall, into our drinking water, in a lot of areas. Now we're talking about an environmental disaster that's not only coastal marshes and pelicans and some food chain organisms, but it starts affecting people. And in fact, I've read several places of behind-the-scenes plans to remove populations from the coast if this sort of thing starts happening. So I didn't want to get too far away from the energy thing, but the impact of this thing may be much, much larger than anybody can even imagine or speaking about publicly. And that's why,
right. And a lot of these, volatile organic compounds,
yes, benzene and others,
and these dispersants and the other petrochemical compound, this slurry that could be picked up by, say, a hurricane or a tropical storm, and moved over vast areas of the United States and the southern all the way up to New England, that what you could have from that are a whole lot of sort of atomized, like when you spray a perfume bottle and it's little fine particles of this junk, all in the air and in the water and in the rain, and it's toxic and it's cancer-inducing, but it also destroys the immune system. So you're going to see a whole bunch of problems. And in fact, the workers, one of the big cover-ups that's happening right now is that British Petroleum is trying to minimize the health effects of this on the workers who are down there. There's some 20,000 people they claim are trying to clean this mess up. And, Anderson Cooper on CNN has been covering the fact that many of these people are really getting really sick. And this stuff is toxic. Just breathing in the fumes. But if you get a tropical storm that picks up a huge amount of this stuff that's in the marshes and on the surface of the water and even down deeper in the water, because the water gets churned up with 40 and 50 waves and storm surges, that can be picked up by these swirling cyclone-type tropical storms and hurricanes, and then all that misted, sort of atomized material gets swooshed all over the landmass and falls on people's homes and on crops and on people's persons and in the air they're breathing and in the water table they're drinking, et cetera, and so on. Very, very important. So, and when you think about the fact that since the early 1900s, we haven't needed oil. We haven't needed coal. That there have been these technologies, and I want to bring up something here. And again, I have to be very careful how far I go here because I don't want to burn bridges to people who are behind the scenes trying to help us here in Washington. But there is a very senior member of Congress who's chairman of a subcommittee of the Congress, who has a friend that called us last year, who had been a Department of Energy official. And this person had been, for a period of time, at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where there's, of course, a Department of Energy facility. Oak Ridge has had a long history with, of course, nuclear weapons and armaments and what have you, as well as other research projects. But this person informed us, and this is a very close friend of a senior member of Congress, that while there, that this DOE official had been in a facility where there were dozens and dozens and dozens of these advanced, quote, free energy devices that were in a classified area held away from the public under lock and key. And this dovetails with exactly what we have been told by an inventor and scientist and engineer named John Bedini, who was taken to a facility in Wisconsin years ago by an intelligence agent, where he was shown a facility that was filled with dozens, if not hundreds, of these sort of devices that had been confiscated, some of them dating back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is not an urban myth. And I think that if the president or the private sector in our group, they can't get the support to get the funding to build something like this independently and quickly, that there needs to be the public writing the White House and their members of Congress saying, we want a congressional hearing on this. And because we have people who can be subpoenaed. And when those people are subpoenaed, out is going to come all this information. And, you know, and I think it's we're at the point where, and some years ago I coined this term, and it's planeticide. And that is where we reach a point of such careless, reckless, and intentional suppression of these sorts of advanced energy generation systems, and it's being done with malice aforethought, that Murder Incorporated really is at the point now where they are committing planeticide, the murdering of an entire planet's biosphere, because we have literally thousands of species of plants and animals becoming permanently extinct. National Geographic has stated that we are now in the largest extinction period since the asteroid hit the Earth and caused all the dinosaurs to go extinct some 65 million years ago or so, and that this is all man-made. And it's all avoidable. It isn't as if we don't have anything but nuclear power and gas and coal and oil. We do have them. But these people, who I call Murder Incorporated, are so hell-bent on keeping the world addicted to oil in a centralized macroeconomic system that they control, that they will do almost anything, threaten, lie, cajole, all the things that have happened to us in the last few months that you heard about our last interview with the board of directors of the OrionProject.org. And now we have this catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. And we're going to have more things like this happening. So it's the old adage that unless we change direction, we're going to end up where we're going. And where we're headed here is towards an unmitigated disaster for humanity and for the Earth. And it can be avoided. But it can only be avoided if we, all of us together, join forces, vow to come out with these technologies, because as we've said many times on this program, we've been searching for years for people who are not in these classified projects who might be able to have one of these types of systems developed. But the people who have been able to develop these on their own, many of them have been threatened or are afraid to come forward with them. So we have got to create a secure facility that's here where we can supervise the work and bring together a brain trust of fantastic scientists and physicists and engineers, which is what we're proposing to do in this new proposal. And yes, it's a few $1 million, but for heaven's sakes, you know, the city of San Francisco, which is not a very big town, the city of San Francisco only has 750,000 people in the actual city, funded $5 million for people to study how to capture energy from the waves going in and out of the Golden Gate. That was just to study the feasibility of it, not to build anything. We have a budget that would actually do the research and begin to build these systems for that. So we need to find people who understand this science, and the public and various environmental groups and philanthropists need to hear about this, and we need to get this up and going. This is what we've been trying to do for the last 2 years. We have not raised sufficient funds to do that, but we're hoping we can do it now. And I think people are waking up more and more to the fact that we've got to think out of the box and go beyond wind and solar if we're going to solve these problems. And it's going to be a true revolution in alternative new energy. And this is not being discussed. And as I said, a couple of years ago, I met with a man in Washington who was very close to the Bush administration. That was back when, towards the end of the Bush era. And he said, look, yes, these technologies you're talking about exist, but, and this guy represented a lot of the nuclear power industry, by the way. He says, but they're too good. I said, what do you mean they're too good? He says, well, they're too good because they would disrupt the status quo. I said, well,
that's what's happening anyway.
Yeah, and I said, that's going to happen anyway. We're going to have a financial collapse, and we're going to have an environmental collapse. And how far do you want to play out this scenario into some kind of apocalyptic denouement? I said, we have got to figure out a way to wisely change course, bring out these systems, put them to peaceful energy generation use, and start a civilization on this planet that is abundant, non-polluting, sustainable, etc. That can absolutely be done with the kinds of technologies that Dr. Loder and I have investigated, and also scientists that he and I have met who've actually built them, but who are having their hands tied or are being waved off. So the public needs to know about this and support, and we do want to thank the people who have supported so generously this work. I want to emphasize there's not a single person with the OrionProject.org who gets one dime in salary or anything. All of our resources go to investigating and checking out scientists and technologies and inventions. But what we really want to do is build up a system under controlled circumstances here scientifically, and for that we need to open a lab, get the equipment, and hire a full-time staff of engineers and scientists, and that's going to take a few $1 million, but it's not hundreds of millions. It can be done because one of the things, Ted can speak to this, is that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We have the information that's been collected over the last 100 years by people like Dr. Thomas Bearden and John Bedini and Tony Craddock and the work that's in the open files on T. Townsend Brown's work, the Stan Meyer technologies that have existed, and people we know who worked with Stan Meyer who have an understanding of it. But people, it's unlikely this is going to happen out of people's basements working by themselves alone. We have not seen anyone's been able to do that, and the few that have end up getting intimidated, and they're kind of lone wolves that are easily taken down by this murder incorporated beast that's out there. So it's very difficult, and so the public needs to hear me when I say, look, we've got to find a way of coming together to do this, because it's the fate of the planet. And what kind of planet we're going to have for our children and our grandchildren, and how we're going to be living on this planet. People are talking about these cap and trade regimes, and which also is just a way of saying tax and spend, and having goals to phase out all this fossil fuel stuff by 2080 or 2050, way down the line. We'll all be dead and buried. That's just a way of kicking the ball down the field, passing the buck to another generation, when we have sitting at Oak Ridge and we have sitting in other facilities the definitive solutions that we, the taxpayers, have either developed or have spent money to confiscate by these people who aren't representing us in the government. They're representing the big special interests of big oil and the petrodollar and the big global financial concerns and conglomerates and the transnational corporate nexus of people who want to keep the global economy under their thumb. And I think that this is something that all of us have to understand. We have to, frankly, say no to and rise up against, but not in a violent way, in a velvet revolution way, where we say, look, we're going to come out with these things ourselves, and we're going to do it so that there are millions of people who know about it and support it, and that's what we're asking for.
I want to add a comment to that. Steve has talked about some of the suppression of the individual inventors, and one of the main problems, and we have talked to literally dozens of inventors over the years who have developed something, and somebody's come along and said, we don't think you should be doing this, or they've been very discouraged, either by many ways, being discouraged. And to point out the fact this is not, again, an urban myth, but this actually happens, a gentleman by the name of Gary Vesperman compiled over 100 examples of this with names, places, dates, etc. And he wrote a small book on that, and you'll find it listed on the Orion Project website by Gary Vesperman's Suppressed Energy Technologies.
Vesperman with a V.
Yeah, that is correct. And you'll find it very, very interesting. And you read that, and it actually is kind of depressing because you realize that many of these people did have solutions to what we're talking about. And
well, of course, and we know that Tesla did as well, and he was also suppressed. And then, a lot of people think this is an urban myth, except we have the documents to prove it, and that is when Nikola Tesla, who invented AC electricity and what have you, passed away, the FBI swooped in and confiscated all of his secret papers and information on these things. And the reason we know this is that I have a Department of Defense letter demanding that the FBI turn that information over to the Department of Defense, but the FBI wouldn't do it because the left hand doesn't like to work with the right hand in these secret projects. And so this is a smoking gun that, in point of fact, the FBI did go in there, confiscate this information, and this has been going on for decades. So this nasty little game where our government has been hijacked and infiltrated by these petro-Nazis and people who are absolutely, as Tom Bearden calls them, Dr. Bearden calls them, these devils that are in the system. And it's very, very hard for someone working by themselves or even a small, and that's why we have to do this as on the one hand, an research and development program that has good security around it, but also that is being done with the knowledge and support of millions of people, like those of you listening to the World Puja Network. And again, I want to thank the people of the World Puja Network that they give us this time so we can update you on these incredibly important issues. And I think that this is something that people have to understand that you can't pass the buck and say, well, someone will just come out with one of these things, because people have been coming out with these sort of breakthroughs in technologies for over 100 years, but they all run into this massive buzzsaw of Murder Incorporated that will take them down. And I think this is what we have seen firsthand recently when we began to get these top-secret scientists who have worked in the weird science and frickin' magic, as they call it, area of very advanced transdimensional sciences, and have had people come in and claw them back into the beast because they were working for the beast their whole entire lives. Their pensions are tied to the beast. And so they didn't have the freedom. So we've got to find people who got the courage and the vision and are free to move with us, but then the public and the philanthropy, community of philanthropy, and even investors out there need to say, okay, let's put a few $1 million into this. We're putting, it's interesting. I saw Vice President Biden on Charlie Rose recently, I think in the past week, and he was talking about how there's this $90 billion of the stimulus going into, quote, alternative energy. Not one red cent is going into anything that'll work. Not a penny. Not 1 cent. Not one dime. 90 billion, with a B, billion of our tax dollars. And there's not even 5 million going into the kind of research for which there's this positive proof and evidence of these sort of technologies working. And so we're all still waiting for British Petroleum to drill another well for us. I mean, come on. So this is the kind of insanity that has to stop, and it has to stop because our elected leaders need to hear about it, and then those of you hearing this sort of information need to go out and tell all of your friends, families, coworkers, and anyone who will listen that there are these other solutions, and we need the funding put in place because, there are a lot of people out there who have high net worth who so far maybe just haven't heard about this yet. So we need your help networking this new proposal. Dr. Loder, and we have a man in Washington who does a lot of these sort of proposals for large corporations, and Dr. Bravo are just putting the finishing touches on this proposal that we've been working on since March that will be ready in the next few days to provide to anyone who wants to look at it that has the business plan and the budget and everything and an outline of these sciences that we want to have in this research and development effort. And we think that this is the best way forward. And certainly if we can spend $90 billion on things that are sheer fantasy, such as clean coal, if that's not an oxymoron, and things of this sort, we can certainly put a few million into this area. And I want to point out to people that this has never happened, that you would think that with all the new energy researchers and stuff out there, that there would be some grants and funding that have gone to these various. There's not. So this is an area that has literally and deliberately been starved of research and development funds, the result of which is that the people who do stumble across these technologies end up getting intercepted and threatened because they're kind of lone wolves, as I mentioned, that are very easily attacked. And the big research and development money are all going into things like Dr. Loder just mentioned, and that is things like making a solar panel a little more efficient, making a windmill a little more efficient, how to make coal clean. Now, they don't mention the fact that to get the coal, even before you burn it, even if you can sequester the carbon and the pollution from it, you got to blow up half of Appalachia with mountaintop removal mining to get to the nasty stuff. So there's no such thing as clean coal. That's a complete joke, even though we get half of our electricity in America from coal. So these are all huge problems, and they're not going to be solved with the kind of in-the-box, hidebound thinking. It's going to take courage, but it's also going to take a lot of us saying to the people we know, look, let's pull together and make this a reality. And that's what we're making a plea for this. And the British petroleum debacle, for lack of a better word, catastrophe, it really just underscores the fact that these sort of problems are going to continue on into the future and get worse and worse and worse until we begin to seriously embrace these real solutions.
That's right. That's so right. What I'm just thinking about this, that as we talk about this, the British Petroleum has spent nominally $1 billion so far and counting to clean up the mess they created. A small fraction of that cleanup money could have been put into some technology that would have meant the cleanup would never have been necessary. And British Petroleum could be a hero in the planet for moving into new energy technologies. They call themselves a green company. Instead of being devils whatever. It's just the irony is just disgusting, actually.
And a lot of skeptics, when I first will bring this issue up, will say, well, look, if these technologies do exist in these places, why wouldn't someone come out with it? Because wouldn't that be a very lucrative business? It would be like the next Microsoft and Google and IBM rolled together in one. I said, yes, however, there would be a great industry in making these new energy devices and getting them to replace the old ones that are based on fossil fuel. However, where the real action is, and this is where you get this vertical and horizontal integration into these big transnational corporations that Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, warned us about, is that if you have, let's say you drive a Chevy Suburban, the engine in that thing's worth maybe $5,000, big deal. It will use, at today's oil prices, and if you go to Europe, it's much more than this, but in America, it'll use about $40,000 to $50,000 in gas and oil over the life of that engine, for as long as that vehicle will be on the road driving X number of thousand miles a year. You see? So the money isn't in the engine. The money is in the supply line, the pipeline. And then you get into the big financials, the so-called derivatives and futures markets, where Goldman Sachs and all these big transnational trading corporations are trading on the assets of the oil and gas and coal reserves and minerals that are in the ground. And the churning of commissions and the speculation and the pumping the prices up and then driving them down and pumping them up and driving them down and pumping them up and shorting it and going long and going short. I've studied this. This is where the money is. Well, suddenly all that commodities game becomes irrelevant because the energy is coming from the space around us. The supply line of selling this nasty stuff isn't needed, and you can actually grow. And I mean, people talk about all the people employed in the oil and gas industry, but it's actually, as a percentage of the world's population, it's infinitesimal. the world would go through this economic blossoming, but the people who are at the central control panel, these 200 or 300 individuals and corporations that have 50% of the net worth of the world, literally, those folks are going to see a relative reduction in their power. And that's what this is about. That's what the secrecy and the suppression is about. It is not about national security. It is not about any of the things that they wrap themselves in the Bible and the flag and everything else. This is a complete lie, and it's the big lie. And so what I think people have to understand is that the interest in suppressing this isn't a matter of just how much coal and oil is being sold each year. It's also how much is in the ground that's basing all these derivatives and future markets trading and commodity trading and the petrodollar and on and on and on. That amounts to hundreds of trillions of dollars. And that then begins to see what you're talking about in terms of real money and real geopolitical power and the things that will be done, the kind of corrupt things that are done in the name of national security or in the name of God and America and apple pie to keep us addicted to oil. And the only way this is going to change is for people to become educated on it, demand change, but also walk the walk. And that is provide the funding and the research and development dollars to be able to open a laboratory where the kind of scientists that Dr. Loder and I have met and worked with over the years will come together and do this, because I can tell you that the laws of the universe are universal. I mean, if Nikola Tesla discovered it, or Stan Meyer did, or T. Townsend Brown did in the 1920s with his high voltage anti-gravity type work, it can be discovered again. I mean, we have literally a file that was from an intelligence officer that we acquired recently that's thousands of pages of data on these sort of secret technologies that we're not, the person who supplied it, we're not allowed to provide the name of it, of how we got it, but it's a very important document that our engineers can use. But they have to come together. We need to get them in one place. We need to have a dozen or so top-drawer engineers and physicists and scientists working. And you can't do that with a few $1,000s, because most of these people have current day jobs and families to support. So we're calling on the public and the philanthropic community and the environmental granting community to provide these funds for us. It would be nice if the government would provide a grant to do this kind of work, but unfortunately I think the government is so utterly corrupt that I believe that when I see it, frankly.
Yeah, there's a real problem there, because even if you have one governmental agency who says, oh, this would be great, we support this, we'll give you some grant, somebody else from another agency, again, in using national security issues, change of it, economic issues, etc., comes along and twists somebody's arm. And that's done all the time. And so suddenly one agency will just pull back. And there's a great example, and I'll let you tell the story, Steve. You mentioned it in the past about Bill Richardson's supporting of some technology. I'll let him tell that, because he remembers the details better than I do. But this is very important for
people to understand. Those of you who are concerned with nuclear waste and all the radiation from having all this from power plants and nuclear weapons, we got this junk that they're saying, gee, where are we going to store this stuff, because it's going to be deadly radioactive nut and crazy stuff for 25,000 years. And we've only had human civilization for a few thousand. So there's a man named Ken Shoulders who had developed something called charged cluster arrays, and I won't go into all the detail, but basically it had a process that really did involve an over-unity effect that would take radioactive waste and neutralize it. Now, he was using kind of low-level stuff, and he was made a presentation, and I met one of the people with his company, or who was working with him at the time, who lives in the D.C. area, and who is, by the way, a lifelong conservative Republican, and not exactly, your Birkenstock kind of new energy sort of person. And he and I met for several hours, and this executive told me, he says, look, we took this all the way to the head of the Department of Energy, Bill Richardson, who is the cabinet-level guy for Bill Clinton. Bill Richardson signed off on it. They authorized, I don't know what it was, a couple $1 million to do work in Illinois at the university there to further this research in cooperation with the Department of Energy, because this would solve the Yucca Mountain problem, where to store all this stuff. And suddenly Virgil Parks with the American Physical Society at the University of Maryland and a whole bunch of other people circled the limousines and made such a stink that even after the grant was published, that they were going to issue this grant for Ken Shoulder's group to go forward with this research and development effort, they pulled the money back, which is almost unprecedented, and refused to provide it. So this is one of the problems, is that these sort of things, even when they seem to be right at the goal line, get snatched back, just like the OrionProject.org signed a contract in December with a top-secret scientist who have worked for 30 years in these advanced physics and who was willing to do this, and then he got attacked and had people go down there, up to and including a former CIA director, to threaten, cajole, and provide all kinds of misinformation, disinformation, lies about our team, on and on and on, so that he had to stop and couldn't go forward. And this is just all in the last few months that we've seen. So this isn't an urban myth. People need to understand. That's why we need to get some real financial support so we can do this independently. And I think that if you look at what happened with Ken Shoulders, if you look at what's happened with the OrionProject.org and these top-secret scientists, and by the way, it wasn't just one that was pulled back. We had 3 or 4 of them that had worked with various 3-letter agencies, CIA and what have you, who knew this area of science, who were agreeing to go forward with us, who within a few weeks were contacted and threatened and pulled back. Now, this is exactly what happens. And so, you know, it's interesting. If you go back to the briefing I provided to President Obama through one of his very close friends and senior associates, on the cover of that, and this is actually up on our website at disclosureproject.org, you'll see that I use a quote from Bobby Kennedy from, I think it's 1966, where he talks about the sort of indispensable quality is moral courage. That, you know, you have to have the moral courage to go forward. And here I'm talking about real moral courage, where you're willing to stand up to these kinds of monsters and to Murder Incorporated. But that's very difficult. You don't find that a lot in government circles with people who are politicians and ambitious careerists in technocrats in the government. And frankly, you don't find it a lot with people who are scientists and engineers either. But I think that we have to find a few people, men and women of conviction, who will come together and do this work, because we know it can be done. But it's going to have to be supported in a professionalized research and development program, unless by some miracle someone has something out there. And look, we're all ears. If somebody out there listening has an operational new energy device that's a serious breakthrough, they can contact us. We have great engineers that are working for free, pro bono for us, who will check out the system. But we require that the person cooperate fully with us. It can't be a cloak and dagger black box and take my word that it works routine, because every one of those we've looked into have ended up being just a complete and utter fraud, frankly.
We've been there.
Yeah, we've been there and done that and bought the T-shirt. And my view of it is that people, if they've really got something legitimate, we are the team that can bring it out to the world. And I can get it in front of a lot of people who are very supportive of doing this, but who don't want to take the leadership. And a lot of people ask me, why don't a lot of these high-level people that I've met with over the years just step up to the plate and do this? And I said, well, it's a little bit, some years ago, Dr. Loder and I were working with this scientist who had a business manager, and he said, well, the key thing you have to understand about these kind of people is that everyone wants to be first to be second. Meaning that
yes,
nobody wants to be the first person to stick their neck out on this because they're afraid they're going to get their head chopped off. But they're happy to be second. So what we have to be is the leadership group. We have to be the leadership team to bring this information out. Then there'll be a lot. Once we open the door on this stuff, then yes, there'll be all kinds of things that will come out once that door is cracked open. But that's that's the hard part. And so that's why we need your help, both your moral support, your prayers, your meditation, your financial support, and most importantly, your networking support to people who can make this a reality for all of us, for humanity, in terms of the research and development we need. This great proposal that Dr. Loder and Dr. Bravo and others have been working on, and that I think that really is a professional document that anyone who needs to do their due diligence will look at it and go, wow, there's really some serious R&D here that can be done, and it deserves the very modest level of support that we're asking for in this grant. So that, that's what we want to do, and I think that one of the things is that if someone like Governor Bill Richardson, who is the head of the Department of Energy, can be dissuaded from supporting something like Ken Shoulders has, where's the leadership? And I think this really is what it boils down to. Now, I do think we need to hold our leaders who would pretend to be leaders, or who at least aver that they are leaders, that they lead. Now, this is why I do think that while on the one hand we need to be moving forward to do this independently, we all need to contact the President and our members of Congress and say, look, we want this issue looked into. We want these technologies released and liberated to benefit the Earth and humanity. We want an executive order from the President getting these technologies brought to bear to fix the leak in the Gulf, but also to bring out energy systems so we don't need to drill more oil. We want a congressional inquiry into this, et cetera, and so on. But that it's not a mutually exclusive strategy. We want to do that and educate these leaders and hope that maybe one of them will actually lead, while we continue to provide the leadership of putting a laboratory together and doing this independently. A curious thing happened when Al Gore of Inconvenient Truth fame canceled going to the Copenhagen Earth Summit this past fall, I believe it was, and he said, well, the real solutions to this energy and environmental and global warming problem will come from the NGOs, which is, policy wonk speak for non-governmental organizations, i.e. groups like the OrionProject.org. And so it's interesting that, I think there are a lot of people, moral support is there, but we have to manifest it. I think people are very much afraid of sticking their necks out, because as this one man I met with who worked with the Bush administration, they view these technologies as disruptive, that there are too many powerful, murderous, ruthless special interests that will do anything to keep them secret, and they don't have the fire in the belly and the moral courage to do it. We do, but we need your help. And we need your help finding the funding sources for this grant proposal, and we need your help in finding people who might know these technologies, or maybe someone listening who actually has an uncle, a friend, a relative, or something who has developed these and has just kept it under wraps, or has had some kind of implied threat communicated to them. We would encourage them to contact us if they're willing to cooperate with our process of investigating and transparently and openly vetting the technology. But we also need your support in contacting the President and members of Congress and saying, look, these technologies exist. Go to the OrionProject.org, and we need to see that there's some real leadership coming out of our elected and appointed officials on this enormous crisis. So that's what we need from you folks, and I thank you in advance. And I also thank you for all that you have done, because we have gotten quite far in this investigation because of the support of people who listen to the World Puja Network. And I think we're about out of time, Ted.
I think that sums things up pretty well today, Steve. We've covered a lot. We've repeated some things we've talked about in the past, but there's always a new audience, and a lot of these things you have to hear twice or three times, think about, and then hear again before it starts to sink in. And at some point the light comes on and you say, oh, my gosh, we're not where we should be.
Exactly. Well, thank you, Dr. Loder, for being with us and sharing your perspective as a chemical oceanographer on this situation. And I'd like to again thank the World Puja Network and all of you who have helped us at theorionproject.org. And until next time, keep up the good work and keep the faith, and we're going to keep moving forward to find the solutions for the beautiful Earth and all of her children. This is
Thank you for listening.
And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.